Hello, and welcome to our Top of Mind podcast. In this program, we are sitting down with Vicki Tambellini to discuss how her top trend predictions for 2020 have changed, or maybe not, since we first discussed them in January of this year. I'm your host, Katelyn Ilkani at the Tambellini Group. Let's get started. Thanks for joining us today, Vicki.
Thanks, Katelyn. I'm glad to be back. It's always fun to look back on predictions. Normally, we'd like to think about predictions in a one-year increment, but things are moving so fast. I think it's a good time to look at predictions that we made earlier in the year and think about how things have changed. So it's good to be with you, and let's get started with the questions that you have.
Thanks, Vicki. So to set the stage for our listeners, you and I originally recorded our Trends podcast in January, and we looked back on 2019, how some things surprised us, and what we thought might happen in 2020. And one of the first topics that you and I discussed was the importance of consensus building on campus when technology leaders are thinking about making any kind of big investment. So how has that changed with the onset of COVID and moving to a remote working environment? Have we seen anything differ in consensus building?
That's a great question. And to answer that, I think it's important to add some context and perspective to our discussion today. When we think about higher education in general, it's easy to talk about higher ed as if higher ed is one thing, and anyone that works in higher education, either from the inside as from the institution perspective or from the outside trying to assist higher education leaders, knows that higher education is not simply one thing, right? Not one, there's no broad way to think about higher education. In fact, the idea that consensus building is important is certainly an underlying theme, regardless of the size or type of institution. But I think we are definitely seeing some changes and some differences in the way decisions are being made, depending on the size and type of institution, and also the way that institutions are being led. And I'll give you some examples. So in the case of large public four-year institutions, for example, where budgets, large percentages of the budgets are driven by state funding, the edicts have come down from the legislatures and from the governors that certain types of spending has been halted or in some cases frozen indefinitely, and leaders have been forced to implement decisions that were completely out of their control. They've been told to make broad-based cuts in areas that they perhaps would like to have had some of their own influence on, but the decisions have been made outside of their control. And so the decisions that they've had to implement have been particularly painful in public institutions. And I think in the private institutions, the private four-year institutions, depending on the way they're governed and the way that not only the type of funding, but the level of governance that they have and oversight from their boards, and also where technology sits in the organization, we've seen different levels of consensus building that becomes necessary in the way that decisions are being made. So we're definitely seeing a diversion now in not only the speed of decisions, but also the way that decisions are being made. And I think that it's created a lot of unrest on campuses across the country as people are unsure of their future, not only as workers, but as their place in the institution and what it means going forward. And it's also led many on campuses to be afraid to move forward in making leadership decisions, which is pretty disconcerting. So we're seeing decisions and leadership fall perhaps into three camps. People that become completely frozen in their ability to move forward because they become so fearful of making any decisions or trying to build any consensus with the decisions that they do have some control over. And then those that are, tiptoeing lightly with the things that they feel like maybe they have to do, that they can make a case for. And then there are the very few that are just moving forward boldly, and fearlessly, with the idea that they've got to do something, or they risk being permanently disintermediated in this pandemic because of the changes that are happening so rapidly around them. So I think consensus building is taking on a whole new meaning within education, and it's disrupting more than just the way people make decisions. It's the whole balance of the structure within our institutions is being challenged.
Vicki, you also mentioned speed to decision. I'd like to know what's happening for timelines for projects. In January, we spoke about timelines being stretched to over a year in some cases to make a decision about big technology investments. What's happening now?
Well, again, it's very situation dependent. So, we look at situations in context where large public four-year institutions had built a case perhaps 2 years ago and gone through a long planning and budgeting cycle. And then in this fiscal year, they've been allocated funding for considerable projects. We've seen that in some cases, in most cases, there's been slight delays, maybe 6 months to a year, but where projects were on the early end or the front end of the process, and the funding had not been allocated in the large public institutions, those decisions have been moved out perhaps 2 to 3 years or longer. And in the private institutions, research institutions, for example, where there's a large hospital presence, for example, where private 4 years, where the large medical centers are associated with the institution, many of those institutions have significant losses related to the COVID response. And even those institutions that had major projects that were considered critical for their infrastructure, those projects have been sidelined because of this, the losses that in some cases are in the tens of millions of dollars related to the COVID response. And in exchange, the shifts are to looking at best of breed type responses to, budget and planning, for example, if that's an area that needed to be addressed. So I think for each scenario and with each size and type of institution, we have to look deeper to find out exactly how COVID has impacted the sector or the subsector within education, to understand the likely impact, and then what the response can be, not only from the institution perspective, but also from the entire ecosystem that's endeavoring to support institutions through what is, arguably one of the most difficult times that we've ever faced.
So it sounds like priorities in general on campuses have shifted, and it's causing some major disruption. COVID seems to be having some big downstream impacts. How are you seeing campus technology priorities specifically change? So are we seeing major transformation projects on hold? generally, or is that also institution specific, or a big change to certain types of technology projects?
Yeah, so I think in large public 4 years where major ERP projects were well underway earlier this year, those projects are on track for the most part within the year that they have been planned. For private, not-for-profit institutions, we've seen that the problems that they were trying to address certainly have not dissipated. So institutions are looking at ways to either look at the problem differently, look at the problem with some sort of delay, or figure out a way to repurpose their existing ERP with third-party applications in support of their environment. So in some cases, we're seeing institutions with legacy systems look to move their client server applications to cloud or cloud hosting, cloud managed services, for example. We're seeing more institutions thinking seriously about shared services. I mean, the conversation around shared services is not new. What I think is new is the very serious discussion around what shared services could mean in a specific environment, and how, in particular, public institutions could make a shared services environment work, actually defining what shared services could mean for not only cost savings but efficiencies, and then what an implementation of shared services might look like. Because these are people problems, right? That's not really even a technology problem, because the idea of a shared services environment has much less to do with the technology and much more to do with the change management and the change in business processes associated with all the implementation around having people work differently and serving your constituents differently. So it's a big change in the way people will have to work. But I think now that people are working differently and more people are working from home and more people are talking about maybe never returning to a campus office or returning on rotating shifts, there's more serious interest in looking at how shared services could be implemented.
We've spoken a lot about the institutions themselves and changes that have to be made or are actively being made on campuses, but I'm curious about what's happening with vendors who are serving higher ed too, because they're probably also scrambling to make changes right now. And are we seeing that roadmaps are being really impacted, or people are coming out with new and interesting technologies?
Yeah, that's a great question. And in the same way that I think that we can't look at higher education and say there's one specific trend, I would say that within the vendor environment, there's the same kind of thing is happening on the vendor side. So certainly in the ecosystem, we have seen broad changes on the what I would call the independent, small and medium-sized vendors. We've seen a increased investment in thinking about how to serve higher education, and in particular the part of the segment that any one vendor is the best at serving. And for example, we had an inquiry yesterday from a vendor that works in the advancement space. They've been particularly successful in one area. They're looking to expand, and they're thinking about adding considerable new services. Anyway, it's just one example of how we're engaging with vendors right now. And I think that we are seeing that in particular segments that's happening. On the other hand, there was a large vendor in that very same space that many people will be familiar with that went through massive layoffs in the May timeframe. probably 10% of their workforce was laid off, and some of those layoffs impacted higher education. So I think that the vendor side is very dependent on whether or not the vendor is public, whether they're investment bank owned, and so forth. And we have seen significant cost cutting in some of the very largest vendors, and it does cause great concern for us. We're looking very closely at some of the largest vendors, some of the largest public vendors that serve higher education now, and we're doing some significant analysis to compare roadmaps over the last 24 months or so to look at how those have changed. And what the early indications are that, yes, to your question, roadmaps are falling short. And we think that the decisions are being made don't necessarily indicate, I want to say, like, it's not that the vendors aren't investing in higher education, but they're shifting their dollars either to lower paid people, or perhaps they're looking at higher education differently in light of the fact that spending has slowed. And I think that's short-sighted, but when you think about public companies, their obligation is sometimes looked at to shareholders first. And so we'll be writing more about that. But again, that's not every vendor across every application area, but it is something that I think institutions have to be concerned about and should be asking about before they make investments, about the commitment to higher ed and how those investments are changing.
Vicki, this next question is a really broad one, and I'm very curious to hear what you think about this. We're here at the end of August, coming into the fall semester, and so much has changed. Institutions are under a lot of stress, vendors are under stress. What do you think the rest of this year and then coming into 2021 will look like?
Well, we're, just as in the last question, when you asked about some of the decisions that vendors are making, we're also seeing some institutions making some alarming decisions, frankly. We've seen institutions making decisions to eliminate the office of the CIO. And in our early analysis, it looks to us like and it doesn't matter for in this discussion that the size or type of institution, the office has been eliminated in a very large research institution, and a very relatively small private liberal arts institution. The things that we're seeing that are consistent is when that's happened, the CIO has reported to the CFO. And we know that in higher ed, roughly a third of CIOs report to CFOs, a third report to the provost, and about a third report to the president. There's been a long ongoing discussion over time about where should the CIO report, and how strategic are technology decisions on campus. And I think that one thing that we know from the crisis that we've all been living through is that technology is an enabler for everything that we have to do. And the work of the office of the CIO has been astounding. People have been able to accomplish amazing things working from home, to enable security, to enable CRM, to enable teaching and learning. And the very idea that a CIO is not necessary is mind-boggling to me and to others that we've been talking to. And so I think that's something that we want to call to the attention of leaders to really think through. What does it mean to be a CIO in an institution, and how important is that role? Where should it report? Should that role be valued, and why? and what is the risk to eliminating the role, for example. So that's a big concern that we're looking at. And I think that the institutions that are really thinking forwardly are looking at how to reimagine the threats that are coming from every angle, and not just the health threats that we're all facing, but the threats of competition from other sources that may have never been relevant before, the ideas that paying attention to staff and human resources in ways that we've never had to think about before, and really getting better at understanding what the data shows us in our work is going to be critical to be able to manage remotely and effectively for institutions of the future, because the need for education is not going to go away. I mean, the idea that people want to learn and people need education to thrive in our world is certainly a concept that's as old as time. The way we learn, the way we achieve the education that we thrive for as human beings may continue to shift over time. At what cost, with whose money, by whom, for what purpose, all that may continue to change. And the institutions that are going to thrive through this will have leaders that will be able to continue to reimagine not only the delivery, but the cost and the flexibility that they have to adjust to this changing world. So thank you for asking.
Vicki, thanks so much for joining me and sharing your expertise. This concludes our Top of Mind podcast. Check back with us next month for another great topic. And don't forget to check out Tambellini's other resources on our blog and YouTube channel. See you next time.